Her husband left her with a worthless shack, but her dog wouldn't stop digging until she found why. The road ended in silence, deep in the woods where no one came anymore. Marian stood in front of a collapsing shack her husband had handed her like an insult, the last piece of a life erased overnight. But as the wind moved through the trees, her German shepherd froze, staring at something beneath the floor, something no one had ever meant for her to find. Would you have walked away from that place? Or stayed to uncover what was hidden? Tell me what you'd do. The coffee maker clicked off with its usual soft sigh, filling the kitchen with the familiar scent Marian Doyle had woken up to for decades. It was a small, comforting ritual, one she could perform without thinking. 64 years old, and she still moved through mornings the same way. Kettle, mug, toast, the quiet hum of a house that once felt full. Outside, the Spokane sky was pale and undecided, that gray-blue stretch between night and day. The maple tree in the backyard stood bare, its branches thin and reaching, like it was waiting for something, too. Marian wrapped her fingers around the mug, letting the warmth settle into her palms. She stood at the sink, looking out through the window, not really seeing anything in particular. The neighbor's porch light flickered off. Somewhere down the street, a car engine turned over. Ordinary sounds. A normal morning. Behind her, she heard footsteps. Victor never came into the kitchen this early anymore. Not for years. She turned slightly, just enough to see him enter. He was already dressed. Well, not in his usual work clothes, not the worn slacks or the jackets she used to press for him, but something sharper, tailored, new. It fit him differently, like it belonged to a version of him she didn't quite recognize. "You're up early," she said, her voice soft, careful, as if anything louder might break something fragile in the air. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood there, just inside the doorway, his hands at his sides. There was a distance in his posture that made Marian's chest tighten before she understood why. "We need to talk," Victor said. It wasn't the words. It was the way he said them. Marian had been married long enough to recognize tone the way other people recognized faces. This wasn't about bills or schedules or the leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom. This was something else, something final, and she set the mug down slowly. "Okay," she said. They moved into the living room, though Marian couldn't remember deciding to walk there. The house felt different already, like it had shifted beneath her feet. She sat on the edge of the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Victor remained standing for a moment, then took a chair across from her. Across from her, not beside. That detail landed somewhere deep, though she couldn't yet name why it mattered. Victor exhaled once, like he was getting ready to deliver a line he'd practiced. "I've been thinking about this for a while," he said, "and I've made a decision." Marian nodded, but she didn't trust herself to speak. "I want a divorce." The word hung in the room, heavy and out of place, like it didn't belong in a house that had held 40 years of birthdays, holidays, on quiet dinners, and shared mornings. Marian blinked. What?" she asked, though she had heard him clearly. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," Victor continued, his voice even, almost detached. "The paperwork is being prepared. It won't take long." Her mind struggled to catch up, like it had slipped on ice and couldn't find its footing. "Victor, where is this coming from?" she asked. He didn't look at her. Not really. His eyes passed over her, like she was part of the furniture. "I've met someone," he said. "Her name is Lila." The name meant nothing, just a sound. But Marian felt it land like something sharp. "How long?" she whispered. "A few months." A few months. Marian tried to fit that into the timeline of her life. The dinners she'd cooked, the quiet evenings, the nights he'd said he was working late. Now it all rearranged itself in her mind, pieces sliding into place with a clarity that made her stomach turn. "She's younger," Victor added, as if it were a detail worth mentioning casually. Marian gave a small, almost disbelieving laugh. "Younger?" she repeated. He hesitated, then said, "She's 32. The room tilted. 32. Their daughter was 36. Marian pressed her hands together harder, her fingers trembling now. "We've been married for 40 years, she said, her voice barely steady. 40 years, Victor. We built this house, we raised a family. I know," he interrupted, not unkindly, but without warmth. "And I've done my part. I've worked. I've provided. But I'm not happy anymore, Marian." Not happy. The simplicity of it was almost unbearable. "And you think this fixes that?" she asked. "Oh, I think it's time I live the rest of my life the way I want to," he said. "I've spent decades doing what was expected. I'm done with that." Marian stared at him, searching his face for something. Regret, hesitation, anything that resembled the man she had known. But there was nothing there she recognized. Just resolve. Cold, steady resolve. "What about me?" she asked quietly. The question seemed to catch him off guard for a second, but only for a second. "You'll be taken care of," he said. "My lawyer will explain everything. It'll be fair." Fair. Marian felt something hollow open inside her. 40 years of small sacrifices no one ever noticed. Of building a life that had revolved around his needs, his schedule, his comfort. Reduced to a word. Fair. Victor stood then, smoothing the front of his jacket as if the conversation had reached its natural end. "I'll be staying somewhere else for a while," he said. "You'll hear from the lawyer this week." He paused at the doorway, but he didn't turn back. "Marian, this is for the best." The front door opened, closed, and just like that, the house was quiet again. Marian didn't move. The coffee in the kitchen had gone cold. The morning light had shifted slightly, creeping across the floor, touching the edges of furniture she had chosen years ago. Everything looked the same. But nothing was. She sat there, her hands still clasped in her lap, staring at the empty space where Victor had been. 40 years. She tried to feel something clear, anger, grief, disbelief, but it all came at once, tangled and overwhelming. Instead, there was only one thought that surfaced, quiet and devastating in its simplicity. It hadn't mattered. All of it. It hadn't mattered at all. And Marian Doyle, who had spent most of her life knowing exactly where she belonged, sat alone in her living room and realized she had no idea where she stood anymore. Not in this house. Not in his life. Not even in her own. The morning had started like any other. But by the time the sun fully rose over Spokane, everything she had built had already ended. And there was no one left to tell her what came next. The courthouse in downtown Spokane smelled faintly of old paper and polished floors. A place where decisions were made quickly and remembered forever. Marian Doyle sat in a stiff-backed chair, her hands folded in her lap, just as they had been that morning in her living room weeks ago. Only now, the silence around her wasn't quiet. It was filled with voices, footsteps, the shuffle of files, and the low murmur of lives being rearranged. She had worn her best coat. It was navy blue, tailored years ago when appearances still mattered in ways she understood. She had stood in front of her bedroom mirror that morning, smoothing the collar, brushing a stray piece of lint from the sleeve. For a moment, she had almost recognized the woman looking back at her. Almost. Across the room, Victor sat at a long table with his attorney. He looked comfortable, settled, like this was just another meeting, another deal to finalize. His posture was relaxed, his expression neutral, as though the past 40 years had been filed away neatly, no longer relevant. He didn't look at her. Marian noticed that too. And her own attorney sat beside her, a court-appointed man named Douglas Price, who had introduced himself quickly and kindly, but without much confidence. He spoke in practical tones, explaining procedures, timelines, expectations. Marian nodded when appropriate, but most of his words passed through her without landing. "Try to stay calm," he had said softly before the hearing began. "We'll do the best we can." The best we can. Marian wasn't sure what that meant anymore. The judge entered and everyone stood. The room settled into order. Papers were arranged, voices lowered. The machinery of decision began to move. Victor's attorney spoke first. A woman in a gray suit, precise and composed, with a voice that carried easily across the room. She spoke about assets, about ownership, about contributions, just words that sounded clean and professional, stripped of anything human. Mr. Doyle has been the primary financial provider throughout the marriage, she said. All major assets, the home, investment accounts, retirement funds, are directly tied to his income and professional activity. Marian felt her fingers tighten against each other. She had expected this. In some vague, distant way, she had known it would sound like this. Still, hearing it spoken aloud made something inside her shrink. Her attorney cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his seat. Mrs. Doyle contributed significantly to the household over 4 decades, he said. She managed the home, raised their child, supported non-financial contributions, Victor's attorney interrupted gently, almost politely, which, while valuable in a personal sense, are difficult to quantify in legal terms. Difficult to quantify. Marian stared at the table in front of her. 40 years. Meals cooked, clothes washed, holidays planned, schedules managed. The invisible work that held everything together, reduced to something that couldn't be measured. The judge nodded slowly, making notes. And what about Mrs. Doyle's future needs? Her attorney pressed. Mr. Doyle is prepared to offer temporary alimony, the woman replied. 5 years. Sufficient for Mrs. Doyle to re-establish herself. Re-establish herself. Marian almost laughed at that, but the sound caught in her throat before it could form. Re-establish what? She was 64 years old. There was nothing left to return to. The proceedings continued, moving from one asset to another. The house, awarded to Victor. The accounts, awarded to Victor. The vehicles, awarded to Victor. Each decision landed with the same quiet finality. Not cruel, not loud, just absolute. At one point, Marian glanced up. Victor was leaning slightly toward his attorney, listening, nodding, occasionally making a note. His expression never changed. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look guilty. He looked efficient, like he was completing a task. The last item came almost as an afterthought. There is one additional property, Victor's attorney said, flipping a page. A structure located near the Idaho border. Rural land, approximately 20 acres. The property includes a small, uninhabitable shack. It has not been maintained and holds no significant market value. The judge looked up briefly. And Mr. O'Doyle is proposing? That the property be transferred in full to Mrs. Doyle, she said, as part of the final settlement. There was a pause. Marian blinked. A shack. She hadn't even known it existed. Her attorney leaned toward her slightly. It's something, he whispered. Land has potential, even if it's remote. Something. The word echoed strangely in her mind. Mrs. Doyle, the judge prompted. Marian opened her mouth, then closed it again. What was there to consider? Everything else was already gone. Fine, she said quietly. The gavel came down with a sharp, final sound, and just like that, it was over. The room began to move again. Chairs scraped, papers were gathered, conversations resumed. Marian stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. She didn't remember walking toward the door, but somehow she was there, laying her hand on the handle, the world beyond the courtroom waiting for her. Behind her, she heard a soft chuckle. Victor. Enjoy the property, he said, not loudly, but loud enough. I'm sure it'll suit you. There was something in his tone, something light, almost amused, that made her stop for just a second. Not long enough for him to see her face, just long enough for the words to settle. Suit you. She stepped out into the hallway. The courthouse felt colder now, the air sharper. People passed her, moving with purpose, carrying files, speaking into phones, living lives that hadn't just been dismantled in a matter of minutes. Marian walked down the long corridor, her footsteps slow, measured. In her hand was a single envelope, thin, light. Everything she had left reduced to paper. But she pushed through the front doors and into the afternoon light. Spokane moved on around her. Cars passed. Voices carried. Somewhere, someone laughed. Marian stood on the steps for a moment, the envelope held loosely at her side. 40 years. A house. A life. And now, a shack. The word felt unreal. She opened the envelope slightly, just enough to see the printed address inside. A place she had never been. A place no one had ever spoken about. A place that had been handed to her like a leftover. Marian closed the envelope again. Her fingers trembled, but her face remained still. There were no tears. Not here. Not now. She took a step down from the courthouse, then another. There was nowhere specific to go. No plan. No next step. Only the quiet, undeniable truth settling into her bones with every movement forward. As this was what she was worth. On paper. And there was nothing left to argue. The house felt too big now. Marian stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by things that used to feel permanent. Bookshelves lined with novels she had carefully arranged. Framed photographs from holidays and birthdays. The soft indentation on the couch where Victor used to sit. Everything was still there, untouched. But none of it belonged to her anymore. The silence had changed. It was no longer peaceful. It pressed in from all sides, filling every corner of the house with something heavy and unfamiliar. She moved slowly, almost cautiously, as if the space might reject her at any moment. 7 days. That was what Victor had given her. 7 days to dismantle 40 years. Marian opened the hall closet and reached for a box. But the cardboard felt thin in her hands, fragile in a way that made her pause. She set it down on the floor and stared at it for a moment before beginning. She didn't know where to start. So she chose the easiest thing. Books. They had always been hers. One by one, she pulled them from the shelves. Paperbacks worn soft from years of reading. Hardcovers she had saved for special occasions. Old bookmarks still tucked between pages. Each one carried a memory, but she didn't stop to linger. Not yet. She placed them carefully into the box, stacking them neatly, as if order still mattered. Behind her, there was a soft sound. A shift. Marian turned. Coda stood in the doorway. The German shepherd had always been quiet in his movements, but now there was something different in the way he watched her. His ears were slightly forward, but his body still, his dark eyes fixed on her face as if he were trying to understand something she couldn't explain. "Hey, boy," she said softly. Her voice sounded strange in the empty room. Coda took a few slow steps toward her, then stopped, sitting down just a few feet away. He didn't look at the boxes. He didn't look around the room. He only looked at her. Marian swallowed. "I guess it's just us now," she said. The words hung there, more real once spoken. Coda's tail moved once against the floor, a quiet, steady rhythm. He didn't question it. He didn't hesitate. He stayed. Marian let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She reached out and rested her hand on his head, her fingers sinking into the thick fur behind his ears. "You're not going anywhere, are you?" she murmured. Coda leaned slightly into her hand. Oh, no, he wasn't. The next few days passed in a blur of small decisions and quiet goodbyes. Marian packed what she could fit into her car. Clothes, a few dishes, some blankets. She chose only what felt necessary, though she wasn't entirely sure what that meant anymore. The rest stayed behind. The dining table where they had hosted Thanksgiving dinners. The armchair by the window where she used to read in the afternoons. The dishes she had picked out years ago, one piece at a time. Objects she had once believed would last forever. Now they felt like things belonging to someone else. Neighbors came by once or twice. They stood at the door, offering soft words and sympathetic looks. Marian thanked them, nodded when expected, kept her voice steady. No one stepped inside. No one stayed long. Divorce was something people acknowledged, but didn't linger near. Her son called on the third evening. "Mom, you don't have to do this," he said. "You can stay with us for a while. We'll figure something out." Marian stood in the kitchen. The phone pressed to her ear, Coda lying at her feet. "I'll be fine," she said. "You don't even know what that place is like." "I'll manage." There was a pause on the other end. "Just don't make it harder on yourself than it has to be," he said. Marian closed her eyes briefly. "I won't," she replied, but she could hear it in his voice. The distance. Not unkind, not uncaring, just separate. When the call ended, she stood there for a long time, the quiet settling in again. Coda shifted slightly, resting his head on her foot, grounding her, reminding her she wasn't entirely alone. On the 7th morning, Marian loaded the last box into her old sedan. The trunk was full, the back seat crowded. It didn't look like much. It didn't look like a life. She stood in the driveway, her keys in her hand, staring at the house. 40 years. The windows reflected the pale morning light, giving nothing back. No memories, no warmth, just glass. Marian waited, as if something inside her might urge her to walk back inside, to take one last look, to say goodbye properly. But nothing came, only a quiet understanding. There was nothing left for her there. Coda jumped into the passenger seat, turning once before settling in. He looked at her through the open door, his expression calm, patient, ready. Marian nodded slightly, more to herself than to him. "Okay," she said. She got into the car and closed the door. The engine started with a low, familiar hum. For a moment, she sat there, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. The house stood in front of her, unchanged, as if none of this had happened, as if she hadn't just been erased from it. Marian exhaled slowly. Then she shifted the car into gear. The tires rolled forward, crunching softly against the driveway. She didn't look back. The streets of Spokane unfolded in front of her. Familiar roads, familiar turns, places she had driven countless times without thinking. Now each one felt like a quiet farewell. The city slowly gave way to open stretches of road. Buildings thinned, houses grew farther apart. Trees began to line the highway, tall and silent. Coda sat upright beside her, watching the world pass by through the window. Every so often he glanced back at her, as if checking that she was still there. No, she was, but barely. The further they drove, the less the world felt like something she recognized. The map in her mind had ended somewhere back in the city. Now there was only direction, only distance, and the quiet, steady presence of the one living thing that had chosen not to leave her. As the road stretched ahead, disappearing into the distant line of trees, Marian tightened her grip on the wheel just slightly. She didn't know what waited for her at the end of it. She didn't know what kind of place a man would call worthless. But she knew one thing with a certainty she hadn't felt since that morning in her living room. Whatever was waiting for her there, she wouldn't face it alone. The paved road ended without warning. One moment, Marian was following a narrow highway cutting through tall pines. The next, the asphalt gave way to gravel, loose, uneven, and loud beneath her tires. The sound changed everything. It filled the car, constant and rough, like a reminder that she had crossed into somewhere unfamiliar. She slowed instinctively. The trees thickened on both sides, closing in until the sky above became little more than a thin ribbon of pale gray. The deeper she drove, the quieter it became. No passing cars, no distant houses, just forest. Coda shifted beside her, lifting his head slightly, his ears alert but not tense. "You see something I don't?" Marian murmured. He didn't answer, of course. He just watched. The directions printed on the deed were vague. An old county road, a turn marked by a rusted sign, a stretch of land that didn't seem to belong to anyone anymore. She almost missed it. A narrow break in the trees, barely wide enough for a car, marked by a wooden post leaning at an angle. The lettering had faded almost completely, but she could just make out the name. Doyle Property. The irony didn't escape her. She turned the wheel slowly, guiding the car onto the overgrown path. Branches brushed against the sides, dry and brittle, scratching faint lines into the paint. The road, if it could still be called that, was uneven, full of dips and shallow ruts that forced her to crawl forward inch by inch. It felt like driving into something forgotten, or something abandoned on purpose. After what felt like longer than it should have, the trees opened just enough for her to see it. The shack. Marian brought the car to a stop and turned off the engine. For a moment, she didn't move. The silence was immediate and complete, pressing in from every direction. No wind, no birds, just stillness. She stared through the windshield. Victor had called it a shack. That had been generous. The structure leaned slightly to one side, as if it had been trying to fall for years but hadn't quite finished the job. The wood was darkened with age and weather, warped in places, split in others. One corner of the porch had collapsed inward, leaving a jagged gap where boards hung loose. Several windows were broken. The roof sagged in the middle, and the entire place was surrounded by tall grass and creeping vines that had begun to claim it as their own. Marian felt her chest tighten. "This is it," she said quietly. The words sounded unreal. Coda stood, placing his front paws on the edge of the dashboard, peering out with focused attention. He didn't bark. No, he didn't growl. He simply watched. Marian opened the car door. Cold air rushed in, sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. It was different from the city. Thinner somehow, quieter in a way that felt almost heavy. She stepped out slowly, her boots crunching against gravel. The ground felt uneven beneath her feet. Real, unforgiving. Coda jumped down beside her, landing with a soft thud. He stood close for a moment, his body angled slightly toward her, as if waiting for a signal. Marian looked at the shack again. For a brief second, something flickered in her mind. A thought she didn't want to fully form. Turn around. Go back. Find somewhere else. But just as quickly, another image followed. Victor's face in the courtroom. That quiet smirk. "Enjoy the property." Her jaw tightened. No," she said under her breath. "Not this, not after everything." She stepped forward. The porch creaked under her weight. The wood soft in places, brittle in others. She tested each step before committing to it, her movements slow, deliberate. The front door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. There was no lock, no barrier, just a push. Marian reached out, her fingers brushing against the rough surface of the wood. It felt cold, worn smooth in some places, and splintered in others. She hesitated. Then she pushed. The door opened with a low, dragging sound. The smell hit her first. Mold, dust, something stale and damp that had been sealed inside for years. Marian instinctively stepped back, covering her nose with her sleeve. "God," she whispered. Coda moved forward instead. He stepped past her. On crossing the threshold, without hesitation, his paws made soft sounds against the wooden floor as he began to move through the space, slow and steady, his nose low, taking everything in. Marian watched him for a moment. Then she followed. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through broken windows and gaps in the walls. The room was small, one main area with what might have once been a kitchen in the corner, and a narrow ladder leading to a loft above. Everything was covered in dust. Debris littered the floor, old boards, scraps of fabric, something that might have once been furniture. The ceiling showed signs of water damage, dark stains spreading outward like old wounds. It wasn't just neglected. It was abandoned. Marian took another step inside, then another. The floor creaked beneath her weight. She turned slowly, taking it all in. "This," she began, then stopped. There were no words for it. No polite way to describe something that had been left behind this completely. Coda moved through the room with quiet purpose, pausing occasionally to sniff at corners, to investigate shadows, to map the space in a way she couldn't yet. He didn't seem afraid. That struck her. He wasn't cautious. He wasn't hesitant. He acted like this place, this broken, forgotten place, was something to understand, not something to avoid. Marian wrapped her arms around herself. The cold had already begun to seep through her coat. "This is where I live now," she said softly. The words settled into the space, absorbed by the silence. Coda returned to her side, brushing lightly against her leg before sitting down, his body angled toward the open doorway. Protective. Present. Marian looked at him, then back at the room. Her throat tightened. For a moment, everything inside her felt like it was unraveling all over again. The courtroom, the house, the life she had just left behind. It all rushed back, colliding with the reality standing in front of her. This place, this ruin. It would have been easy to walk away, to get back in the car, to drive until she found somewhere else. Anywhere else. But she didn't move. Instead, she took a slow breath, then another. And as she stood there, surrounded by broken wood and fading light, something small shifted inside her. Not hope, not yet, but something harder, stubborn. "He thinks this will break me," she said quietly. Coda's ears twitched slightly at the sound of her voice. Marian straightened, just a little, when her eyes moved across the room again. But this time something was different. The damage was still there. The decay hadn't changed, but she was seeing it differently now. Not as an ending, as a challenge. "All right," she said. The word was steady, grounded. She stepped further into the room, her boots pressing into the dust-covered floor. "Let's see what we can do." Outside, the forest remained silent. Inside, for the first time since she had arrived, Marian Doyle took ownership of the space. Not because it was given to her, not because it was all she had left, but because she had decided not to turn away from it. And Coda, sitting quietly at her side, didn't look at the broken walls or the sagging ceiling. He looked at her as if he already knew. This place hadn't broken her yet. The first night proved otherwise. But by the time the sun disappeared behind the trees, the temperature dropped fast, faster than Marian had expected. The air inside the shack turned sharp and biting, slipping through cracks in the walls and broken edges of the windows like it had permission to be there. Marian sat on the floor, wrapped in 2 blankets she had pulled from the car. The dust had settled slightly, but the smell still lingered. Old wood, damp rot, something forgotten. She had cleared a small space near one wall, just enough to sit without brushing against debris. Coda lay beside her, his body curled close, his warmth steady against her side. There was no electricity, no heat, only darkness. The kind of darkness that didn't belong to a room but to the woods outside. Thick and complete. When she turned off her flashlight to conserve the battery, it swallowed everything. Marian pulled the blankets tighter. "This is temporary," she whispered to herself. The words sounded fragile. The wind picked up sometime after midnight, pushing softly against the walls, finding its way through every weakness in the structure. The wood creaked, shifting in small, unsettling sounds that made it impossible to tell what was inside and what might be outside. Marian didn't sleep much. Every time her eyes closed, her mind drifted back to the house, the courtroom, Victor's voice. The silence here didn't soothe her. It forced her to hear everything she had been trying not to think about. Around her, the shack groaned quietly. Beside her, Coda didn't move. His breathing was slow, steady, untroubled. At some point near dawn, exhaustion finally pulled her under for a short, restless sleep. When she woke, the cold had settled deep into her bones. The light filtering through the broken windows was pale and thin, barely enough to chase away the shadows. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then she sat up, and it all came back. The shack, the silence, the life she had left behind. Marian pressed her hands against the floor, pushing herself to stand. Her muscles protested immediately, stiff, sore, unfamiliar with the strain of sleeping on hard wood. She exhaled slowly. "Okay," she said. The word felt heavier this morning, but it was still there. She stepped outside. The air was colder than the night before, but cleaner somehow. The trees stood tall and still, their branches catching the early light. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called once, then fell silent again. For the first time since she arrived, Marian noticed something else. A small stream. It ran just beyond the clearing, partially hidden by brush, its surface catching bits of light as it moved. She hadn't seen it the day before. Or maybe she hadn't been looking. Coda moved ahead of her, trotting toward it without hesitation. He lowered his head, drinking, then glanced back at her as if to say, "Here." Marian followed. She knelt carefully by the edge, her knees pressing into damp earth. The water was cold, clear enough to see the small stones beneath the surface. She cupped her hands and brought some to her lips. It tasted clean, simple, real. She sat back on her heels, watching the current move. "Well," she murmured, "that's something. Something." The word felt different now. Not an afterthought. A beginning. But the rest of the morning became about small tasks. Marian opened all the windows that still functioned, letting the cold air push out the stale smell inside. She gathered debris into piles, broken boards, scraps of cloth, things she couldn't even identify anymore. Her hands, soft from years of gentler routines, began to protest quickly. Splinters caught her fingers. Dust clung to her skin. Her back ached from bending and lifting in ways it hadn't in years. She stopped often, more often than she wanted. At one point, she leaned against the doorframe, breathing hard, her arms trembling slightly from effort. "I'm not built for this," she said under her breath. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Coda stood a few feet away, watching her. He didn't react, didn't judge. He simply stayed where he was. But Marian closed her eyes briefly, then straightened again. "Doesn't matter," she added, because there was no alternative. She worked through the afternoon, clearing space inch by inch. By the time the light began to fade again, the shack was still broken, but it was less buried. A path existed now, a place to move, a corner that felt almost livable. She stood in the middle of it, her chest rising and falling with steady breaths, her hands dirty, her arms sore. It wasn't much, but it was more than yesterday. Coda circled the room slowly, his nose close to the floor, pausing occasionally in certain spots as if something had caught his attention. Once he lingered near the back wall, sniffing longer than usual before moving on. Marian noticed, but didn't think much of it. Dogs explored. That's what they did. By evening, the cold returned, creeping in with the fading light. Marian gathered what she could. Blankets, a small camping stove she had brought but hadn't yet used. The flame flickered weakly when she finally got it going, but it was enough to warm her hands, enough to remind her that something here could still be controlled. She sat on the floor again, this time in a space she had cleared herself. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't safe. But it was hers. Coda lay beside her once more, his body close, his presence steady. The silence returned with the darkness, but it felt slightly different now. Less overwhelming. Less final. Marian stared at the small flame in front of her, watching it move. "I made it through one day," she said quietly. The words weren't triumphant. They weren't hopeful. But they were true. One day. No, that was all she had. And for now, it was enough. Outside, the forest remained still. Inside, Marian Doyle sat in the middle of a broken space she had begun, however slightly, to change. Not because she believed she could fix it. Not yet. But because she had started. And somewhere in the quiet, between the cold and the exhaustion and the unfamiliar weight of everything she had lost, something small held. Not strong, not certain, but unbroken. For now, that was enough to keep going. The second week settled into a rhythm Marian didn't expect. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't easy. But it was something she could follow. Wake up with the light. Work until her body gave out. Rest. Then start again. Each day the shack changed in small ways. The debris piles grew outside. The air inside cleared. The floor, what once hidden beneath layers of neglect, began to show its original boards, worn, uneven, but still holding. Marian moved carefully now, learning where the wood was stable and where it dipped under pressure. Her hands had toughened slightly, the skin no longer breaking as easily. The soreness remained, but it felt earned. Coda stayed close, but not always beside her. He had started to roam more. At first, Marian barely noticed. He would disappear around the side of the shack, then return minutes later, calm and quiet as ever. Sometimes he would head toward the stream, circling the same stretch of ground before coming back. It was normal. Dogs explored. That's what she told herself. Until it wasn't. It started with small things. Coda pausing longer than usual near the back corner of the shack. Standing still, nose low, much as if listening to something she couldn't hear. Then the scratching. At first it was faint. A soft, repetitive sound beneath her movements, easy to ignore when she was focused on hauling debris or wiping down surfaces. But once she noticed it, she couldn't unhear it. Scrape, pause, scrape. "Coda," she called one afternoon, setting down a broken plank. The sound stopped. A moment later, he appeared from the far side of the room, his expression calm, as if nothing had happened. Marian frowned slightly. "Were you digging?" she asked. Coda tilted his head. She sighed. "Not inside," she added, though her voice lacked any real authority. He blinked once, then walked past her, his tail low but steady. Marian shook her head and returned to her work. It happened again the next day. This time, she caught him, now he was near the back wall, one paw pressed against the floor, scratching at a specific spot between two boards. His movements were focused, deliberate, not playful. "Coda," she said more firmly. He stopped immediately, looking up at her. For a second, neither of them moved. Then he stepped back, sitting down a few feet away, his eyes still fixed on the spot. Marian walked over, her boots creaking softly. "It's just the floor," she said, more to herself than to him. She nudged the area lightly with her foot. Solid, old, worn wood. Nothing unusual. She glanced back at Coda. He hadn't moved. "All right," she muttered. "Enough of that." She turned away, dismissing it. There were more important things to deal with. By the end of the week, the weather turned. Clouds rolled in low and heavy, pressing down on the forest, and the air thickened, carrying the promise of rain long before the first drops fell. Marian worked faster that day, trying to secure what she could, covering openings, stacking what remained of usable wood, pulling her supplies closer to the driest part of the shack. The storm came just after sunset. Rain hit the roof in uneven bursts at first, then steadily, then relentlessly. The sound filled the space, loud enough to drown out everything else. Water found its way through the weak spots almost immediately. Drops began to fall from the ceiling, slow at first, then faster, forming small dark patches on the floor. Marian moved quickly, dragging a bucket beneath one leak, then another. She spread out what she could, adjusting as new drips appeared. The wind followed. It pushed against the wall, slipping through cracks, carrying cold air that wrapped around her like a second skin. Inside the dim light of her flashlight, the shack felt smaller, more fragile. Coda stood near the center of the room, his body tense now, his ears alert. Not afraid, focused. Then it started again. Scrape. Marian froze. Through the sound of the rain, through the wind pressing against the walls, the noise came back. Louder now, sharper, insistent. Scrape, scrape. She turned slowly. Coda was at the same spot near the back wall, his paw digging harder now, faster, his movements urgent. "Coda!" she called over the noise. He didn't stop. Scrape, scrape. Something in the way he moved, something in the persistence, cut through her frustration. This wasn't random. This wasn't habit. He was trying to tell her something. Marian stepped closer, and her heart beating a little faster. "What is it?" she asked, her voice lower now. Coda paused just long enough to look up at her, then immediately returned to the same spot, scratching again. The board shifted slightly under his paw. Marian saw it this time. A faint movement. barely noticeable, but real. She crouched down, placing her hand on the floor beside where he had been digging. The wood felt different there. Not softer, not broken. Just not as solid as the rest. She pressed down. There was a hollow sound beneath it. Marian pulled her hand back. The storm raged outside, but inside everything seemed to narrow to that one small section of floor. Her breathing slowed. "What?" she whispered. Coda stepped back, giving her space, but he didn't look away. He waited. But Marian reached for the crowbar she had been using earlier, its metal edge cold against her palm. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure why the idea of prying open the floor made her chest tighten. Then she slid the edge into the thin gap between the boards. The wood resisted at first, then gave. With a sharp crack, one of the boards lifted slightly, the nails pulling free with a dry, splintering sound. Marian paused. The opening was small, dark. She swallowed, then pushed again. The board shifted more this time, enough to reveal a narrow space beneath. Cold air rose from it, not like the air from the room. Colder. Still. Marian leaned closer, angling her flashlight toward the gap. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating something below. Not dirt. Not empty space, but depth. More than there should have been. Her grip tightened on the crowbar. Behind her, the storm continued, loud and relentless. Beside her, Coda stood still, watching. Marian didn't move for a long second. Then, slowly, she slid the crowbar back into place and pushed again. For the first time since she had arrived, she wasn't thinking about what she had lost. She was thinking about what might be hidden beneath her feet, and the numbness that had followed her from the courtroom finally began to crack. The storm didn't let up. Rain hammered the roof, wind pushed against the walls, and somewhere outside a branch snapped with a sharp, distant crack. But Marian barely heard any of it anymore. Her world had narrowed to the opening in the floor. She pulled the loose board back further, her hands working faster now. It was driven by something she hadn't felt in weeks. Something sharp and alive. Curiosity. The wood splintered under pressure, nails giving way with stubborn resistance before finally releasing. One board came free, then another, until the gap widened enough for her to see clearly. There was a space beneath the shack. Not just a hollow, a compartment. It ran deeper than she expected, at least 3 feet down, maybe more, and stretched wider than the beam of her flashlight could fully reveal. "This wasn't natural," she whispered. Coda stood close behind her, his body still, his attention fixed on the opening. Marian leaned forward carefully, angling the light deeper. Something was down there. Not debris, not random. Placed. Deliberate. She reached for the edge of the opening and tested her weight, and then slowly lowered herself to her knees. The wood around the gap creaked but held. The air rising from below was cold and dry, older than the damp air in the shack. It carried a faint scent of cedar, and something else she couldn't quite place. Carefully, she slid one leg down into the space, then the other. Her boots met solid ground. Not dirt. Wood. A platform of some kind. Marian steadied herself, crouching slightly as she adjusted to the narrow space. The ceiling above her was low. She couldn't fully stand, but it was enough to move. Her flashlight beam swept across the compartment and stopped. There, against the far side. A box. It was rectangular, about the size of a small suitcase, made of dark wood that had held up far better than anything in the shack above. Metal clasps lined the edges, dulled with age but intact. But Marian stared at it. For a moment she didn't move. The storm outside felt distant now, like it belonged to another place entirely. "What is this?" she murmured. She stepped forward slowly, her boots quiet against the wooden surface beneath her. Each movement felt careful, almost respectful, as if she were entering a space that hadn't been disturbed in a very long time. Coda shifted above her, his silhouette visible at the edge of the opening, watching. Marian reached the box. She crouched down, her fingers hovering just above it. It didn't look abandoned. It looked preserved. She brushed away a thin layer of dust. The wood beneath was smooth, protected. Her hand moved to the clasp. She hesitated. A strange feeling settled over her. Not fear, not exactly, but something close. Yet the sense that whatever was inside this box had been hidden on purpose, and that opening it would change something. Behind her, the wind howled briefly, rattling the structure above. Marian exhaled slowly. Then she opened it. The clasp released with a soft, metallic click. The lid creaked slightly as she lifted it, the hinges stiff but functional. Inside, papers. Bundles of them, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, tied with thin cord that had yellowed with age. Beside them sat a small leather journal, its cover worn but intact. Marian's breath caught. She set the flashlight down so the beam illuminated the contents, then reached for the first bundle. Her fingers trembled slightly as she untied the cord. Inside were documents, old ones. The paper was thick, textured in a way modern paper wasn't. The ink had faded slightly, but the writing was still clear. She unfolded one carefully. A map. Hand-drawn, detailed, marked with measurements and notes she didn't fully understand at first glance. Her eyes moved across it slowly. Land boundaries, elevation markings, and then water. She saw it in the symbols, in the annotations along the edges. References to flow, depth, underground channels. Marian frowned, leaning closer. "This land," she whispered. She reached for another document. A typed letter, dated decades ago. The language was formal, technical, something about survey findings, about an unregistered freshwater source beneath the property. Her heart began to beat faster. She flipped to another page. More notes, more diagrams, all pointing to the same thing. A water source. Not the stream she had seen earlier, something deeper. On underground. Significant. Marian sat back slightly, the paper still in her hands. "Why would this be hidden?" she asked aloud. The question echoed softly in the confined space. She picked up the journal next. The leather was cracked along the edges, but when she opened it, the pages inside were surprisingly well preserved. Handwritten entries filled the first few pages. Dates, observations, mentions of logging activity, small scale, undocumented, notes about the land, about its potential, and then more frequently, about the water. Flow remains consistent, depth greater than expected. Test samples indicate unusual clarity. Must keep this quiet until rights are secured. Marian's eyes moved faster now. Page after page, the pattern repeated. Discovery, interest, then hesitation, concern. Too many questions. Outside interest growing. Decision made to seal access point. Records secured below structure. Marian stopped reading. Her pulse thudded in her ears. Sealed, hidden, on purpose. She looked around the small space again, seeing it differently now. Not as a forgotten crawl space, but as something intentional. A place meant to protect something. Above her, Coda shifted slightly, letting out a soft huff as if reminding her he was still there. Marian let out a slow breath. "The shack," she said quietly. "It wasn't worthless." The words felt strange, unreal. Everything Victor had said, everything he had believed, suddenly felt incomplete. Wrong. She looked back at the documents in her hands. This wasn't just land. This was something else, something overlooked or ignored. Her grip tightened slightly. Or something he never even knew, she added. The thought settled into her mind, sharp and clear. Marian carefully rewrapped the documents, her movements slower now, more deliberate. She placed them back into the box, closing the lid gently this time. Then she stood. The space felt smaller now, not because it had changed, but because she had. When she climbed back up through the opening, Coda stepped back to give her room. As soon as she was on solid floor again, he moved closer, brushing against her side. She placed a hand on his head without thinking. "You knew," she murmured. He looked up at her, calm as ever. Marian glanced down at the exposed opening in the floor. The storm outside was beginning to ease, the rain softening, the wind losing its edge. Inside, the air felt different, not lighter, but charged. Yet the shack was still broken, the walls still cracked, the roof still leaking in places. But beneath it, something had been waiting. All this time. And for the first time since she had stepped into this place, Marian Doyle didn't feel like she had been left with nothing. She felt like she had found something. Something no one else had seen. Something no one else had known. And standing there, with Coda beside her and the hidden space open at her feet, she realized this place had never been empty at all. The storm passed sometime before dawn. When Marian stepped outside the next morning, the world felt washed clean. The air carried that sharp, fresh scent that only came after heavy rain, and the forest seemed quieter, not empty, but settled. She stood on the edge of the clearing, her arms folded loosely, looking out across the land. For the first time since she arrived, she wasn't seeing ruin. She was seeing space, possibility. Behind her, the shack still leaned, still broken, still barely holding itself together, but now it felt like something built over a secret, not the end of a story. Coda moved ahead of her, nose low to the ground, following a path only he seemed to understand. He paused occasionally, circling certain areas, then moving on again. Marian watched him. "You knew something was here," she said quietly. He didn't respond, of course, but he kept moving, as if the answer didn't need to be spoken. Marian turned back toward the shack. The opening in the floor remained exposed, the boards pulled aside, the hidden compartment beneath it no longer hidden. For a moment she considered covering it again, closing it, not sealing it the way it had been for years. But she didn't. Not anymore. Instead, she gathered the box carefully, wrapping it in one of her spare blankets. The documents inside felt heavier now, not just physically, but with meaning she hadn't fully understood yet. She needed answers, and this wasn't the place to find them. By mid-morning, she had loaded the box into her car. The drive back toward town felt different from the first time. The road was still rough, the trees still close, but Marian's hands on the wheel were steadier. Her eyes moved with more focus, more awareness. She wasn't just passing through anymore. She was connected to it. The town sat about 40 minutes away, a small cluster of buildings tucked between the forest and a stretch of open land. A general store, a gas station, and a diner with a faded sign that read, "Mercer's." Marian parked outside the diner. For a moment, she sat in the car, her hand resting on the wrapped box beside her. This was the first time she had stepped back into anything resembling normal life since the divorce. The thought made her hesitate. Then Coda shifted in the passenger seat, his gaze steady. Marian exhaled. "All right," she said. They stepped inside together. The diner was warm, filled with the quiet hum of conversation and the smell of coffee and cooked food. A few people glanced up as the door opened, their eyes lingering for just a second longer than usual. A stranger, with a dog. Marian felt it, that subtle attention. Not judgment, but curiosity. She moved toward a booth near the window, Coda staying close at her side. No one stopped her. No one asked questions. No, not yet. A waitress approached, middle-aged, kind eyes, the kind of face that had seen a lot and didn't make a habit of asking too many questions. "Coffee?" she asked. Marian nodded. "Yes, please." The cup arrived quickly, hot and steady, something familiar in a place that wasn't. Marian wrapped her hands around it, letting the warmth settle into her fingers. For a moment, she just sat there, breathing. Then she reached for the box. Carefully, she unwrapped the blanket and set the lid aside. The papers inside seemed even older under the soft light of the diner. She pulled out the map first, laying it flat on the table. Lines, measurements, symbols she didn't fully understand. "You studying something?" a voice asked nearby. Marian looked up. An older man stood a few feet away, his posture relaxed but attentive. His hair was gray, his face lined with the kind of age that came from years spent outdoors rather than behind a desk. Something like that, she replied. He stepped closer, his eyes moving to the map. That's not new, he said. No, Marian answered. It isn't. He studied it for a moment longer. Where'd you find it? Marian hesitated, then said, On my property. The man's eyebrows lifted slightly. Up past the ridge? Near the old logging land? Marian felt something shift. You know it? Used to, he said. Name's Elias Mercer. He pulled out the chair across from her without asking and sat down, his attention fully on the papers now. That land's been quiet a long time, he continued. People stopped going out there decades ago. Why? Marian asked. Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for one of the documents, scanning it with practiced eyes. Then he nodded slowly. Because of this, he said. He tapped a section of the map. Marian leaned forward. What am I looking at? Elias glanced at her. You don't know? No. He leaned back slightly, folding his arms. That's a water map, he said. Not surface water. Underground flow. Deep channels. Marian's pulse quickened. The journal mentions something like that, she said. Elias nodded. Yeah. I heard stories about it when I was younger. Small operation. Nothing official. They found something out there, but never registered it, never developed it. Why not? Elias's expression shifted slightly. That's the part nobody agrees on, he said. Some say they didn't have the money. Others say they didn't want attention. Marian frowned. Why would anyone not want attention? Elias leaned forward again, lowering his voice just slightly. Because once something like that becomes public, it doesn't belong to you anymore. The words settled between them. Marian looked back at the map. The lines didn't look random anymore. They looked intentional, important. So this could mean something? She asked. Elias gave a small, almost amused breath. Depends what you do with it, he said. Water like that? Clean, deep source? It's valuable. Not always in the way people think, but valuable. Marian sat back slowly. The noise of the diner returned around her, the clinking of dishes, the low murmur of conversation, but it felt distant now. Whoever hid this, she said quietly. They knew what they had. Elias nodded. Yeah, looks that way. And they chose not to use it. Or chose to protect it, he replied. That word lingered. Protect. Marian's gaze drifted to Coda, who lay quietly beside the booth, his head resting on his paws, completely at ease. She thought about the shack, the hidden compartment, the careful wrapping of the documents. None of it felt accidental. This wasn't just forgotten, she said. Elias gave a small nod. No, he said. It wasn't. Marian looked down at the papers again. For weeks, she had felt like she had been pushed into something empty, something discarded, something without value. Now, that feeling was gone, replaced by something else, something sharper, more focused. The land wasn't worthless. It had never been. And neither, she realized quietly, had she. She gathered the documents carefully, and placing them back into the box. Thank you, she said. Elias stood, giving her a long, measuring look. You planning to do something with it? He asked. Marian paused, then answered honestly. I don't know yet. Elias nodded once. Well, he said, whatever you decide, that land's not as simple as it looks. He turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the weight of what she had just learned. Marian sat there for a moment longer, her hands resting lightly on the box. Then she looked out the window. The road stretched ahead, leading back toward the forest, back to the shack, back to the place that was no longer just a place. It was something else now, something with history, with purpose, with choice. And for the first time since she had stepped into that courtroom, Marian Doyle felt something she hadn't expected. No, not relief, not happiness, but awareness. She wasn't standing at the end of something anymore. She was standing at the beginning of something she didn't fully understand yet. And this time, the direction forward was hers to decide. The drive back felt shorter, not because the road had changed, but because Marian had. The trees no longer felt like walls closing in. The gravel road didn't sound as harsh beneath the tires. Even the narrow path leading to the shack seemed familiar now, like something she belonged to. When she pulled into the clearing, the shack stood just as it had before, leaning, weathered, imperfect. But Marian didn't see ruin anymore. She saw work. She stepped out of the car, the box of documents held carefully in her hands. Coda jumped down beside her, stretching once before moving ahead, while his nose already catching scents carried through the damp earth. Marian followed him slowly. The air felt different after the rain, cooler, clearer. The ground was softer underfoot, the earth dark and rich where the water had soaked in. She paused just outside the shack, looking at it. "All right," she said quietly. This time, the word carried something new, not resistance, intention. Inside, the space still bore the marks of everything she had already done. Cleared areas, stacked debris, the exposed section of floor where the hidden compartment had been opened. Marian set the box down gently near the wall. Then she stood still for a moment. Not overwhelmed, not frozen. Thinking. The map, the journal, the water beneath the land. All of it sat just beneath the surface of her thoughts, waiting. But she didn't reach for the documents. Not yet. Instead, she picked up the hammer. The decision was simple. If this place mattered, then it needed to stand. The first swing was awkward. The second, more controlled. By the third, her movements found a rhythm. She started with the broken boards along the wall, removing what was too damaged to hold, replacing what she could with salvaged pieces from the debris outside. Each motion was slower than it would have been for someone younger, stronger, but it was steady, deliberate. Coda moved around her, circling the room, then heading toward the open doorway. He paused occasionally, as if checking the edges of the clearing, then returned again. Always returning. By midday, Marian stepped outside, her arms aching, her hands raw but steady. She wiped her forehead with the back of her sleeve and looked at the small pile of boards she had set aside. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Coda stood near the edge of the clearing, staring toward the trees. "Find something?" Marian called. He didn't move. She walked over slowly, following his line of sight. The ground there looked slightly different, subtle, but noticeable now that she was paying attention. The grass was thinner in one area, the soil darker, almost damp despite the distance from the stream. Marian crouched down. She pressed her hand lightly against the ground. Cool, moist. She frowned slightly. "This is farther than the stream," she murmured. Coda stepped closer, sniffing along the edge of the patch, then moving in a slow circle before stopping again. Marian glanced back toward the shack, then back to the ground. The map flashed in her mind, the lines, the markings. She stood. "All right," she said softly. "Not today." There was too much to do, but she didn't ignore it. She marked the spot with a small rock, placing it carefully where she would see it again. Then she returned to the shack. The afternoon passed in steady work. She reinforced the door first, tightening the hinges, adjusting the frame so it would close more securely. Then she moved to the windows, covering the broken sections with boards cut from what she had salvaged. Each task built on the last. Each improvement made the space feel less temporary, less fragile. At one point, she stepped back and looked around. The light inside had changed. Not brighter, but clearer. The room no longer felt like it was collapsing in on itself, yet it felt held together. Coda moved through it easily now, no longer hesitant in his steps. Marian leaned against the wall briefly, catching her breath. "You're getting used to it," she said to him. He looked up at her, his tail giving a small, quiet movement. So was she. That realization settled in slowly, not with excitement, but with certainty. As the sun began to lower, Marian stepped outside again. The clearing stretched out in front of her, quiet and still. The trees stood tall at the edges, framing the land in a way that felt less like confinement and more like boundary. Defined. She walked toward the marked spot again, her boots pressing softly into the damp earth. Coda joined her without being called. Together, they stood there. Marian looked down. The ground didn't reveal anything obvious, no opening. There's no clear sign of what lay beneath. But she knew now. It was there. Hidden. Waiting. Not forgotten, she said quietly. The words felt important. She didn't fully understand why yet, but she felt it. The land had been overlooked, just like the shack, just like her. Marian let out a slow breath. Then she turned back toward the house. The evening came gradually, the sky shifting from gray to soft gold before fading into blue. Shadows stretched across the clearing, long and quiet. Inside, Marian lit the small stove again. The flame flickered, steady and contained. She sat on the floor, her back against the wall she had reinforced earlier that day. The wood felt stronger now, not perfect but reliable. Coda settled beside her, his body warm against the cold that still crept in from the edges of the room. And Marian stared at the flame. Her hands rested in her lap, no longer trembling. "You gave me this place," she said quietly, her voice almost lost in the soft crackle of the stove. She wasn't sure if she meant Victor or something else. "Thought it was nothing." The words lingered, then faded. Marian leaned her head back against the wall, her eyes moving slowly around the room. The work, the changes, the beginning of something. Not finished. Not even close. But real. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was trying to survive the day. She felt like she was building something, piece by piece, decision by decision. Not for anyone else, not to prove anything, but because it was hers. Outside, the forest remained still. Inside, Miss Marian Doyle sat in a place that had once been meant to break her, and quietly, steadily. She was beginning to reshape it, not just into a home, but into something that belonged entirely to her. The sound didn't belong there. Marian heard it before she saw anything. Low at first, distant, unfamiliar against the quiet rhythm of the forest. An engine. She straightened slowly, the hammer still in her hand. Coda reacted first. His head lifted sharply, ears forward, body alert. A low sound rumbled in his chest. Not quite a growl, but close. The engine grew louder, closer. Marian stepped out onto the porch, her boots pressing against the boards she had repaired just days before. A car appeared through the narrow path between the trees. Not the kind that belonged out here. Dark, polished, and out of place against the rough ground and overgrown brush. Marian felt something tighten in her chest. She didn't need to guess. The car came to a stop just short of the clearing. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened. Victor stepped out. He looked different. Not drastically, but enough. The suit was still sharp, still expensive, but it didn't sit on him the same way it had before. There was a stiffness to his posture now, something less certain beneath the surface. He closed the door and looked around. At the shack. At the land. At her. Marian didn't move. Coda stepped forward slightly, positioning himself just ahead of her, his body angled toward Victor, his stance firm. Victor noticed. "Still have the dog," he said, his voice carrying easily across the space. Marian said nothing. Yet he took a few steps closer, his shoes sinking slightly into the softer ground. "This place," he continued, glancing around, "it's not exactly what I remember." "You didn't come here before," Marian replied. Her voice was steady, even. Victor gave a small, dismissive breath. "No reason to." Silence settled between them. The forest seemed to hold its breath. "What are you doing here?" Marian asked. Victor hesitated. Not long, but long enough. "I read something," he said finally. "An article. Local interest piece. Mentioned this property." Marian's eyes narrowed slightly. "People talk," he added. "Small towns." Of course they did. Go on, she said. Victor glanced toward the shack again, then back at her. They're saying there's something valuable here, he said. Water, land rights, or something like that. Marian didn't respond immediately. She let the words sit, let him hear how they sounded in the open air. And? She asked. Victor stepped closer. I didn't know, he said. When I gave it to you, I genuinely thought it was worthless. Marian felt a faint, almost distant flicker of something. Not anger. Not anymore. Recognition. Of course you did, she said. Victor's jaw tightened slightly. I'm serious, he continued. If I had known, you wouldn't have given it to me, Marian finished. The words landed cleanly, without emotion, without hesitation. Victor exhaled, his gaze shifting away for a moment. That's not the point, he said. It is exactly the point, Marian replied. Coda shifted beside her, his presence steady, unmoving. Victor looked back at her. At Paul. There's a legal angle here, he said, his tone changing slightly. More formal now, more controlled. The property was part of the marital estate. At the time of the divorce, neither of us knew its true value. Marian watched him carefully. I think there's a case to be made, he continued, that I'm entitled to a portion of what it's worth now. There it was, clear, simple, predictable. Marian felt something settle inside her. Not surprise, not even disappointment. Just clarity. You're not here because you made a mistake, she said quietly. Victor frowned. I just said, you're here because you think you're owed something, she continued. He didn't answer. Didn't need to. The truth was already standing between them. Victor shifted his weight slightly. Marian, he said, softening his voice. Oh, things haven't exactly gone the way I expected. The market's been unstable. Some investments didn't work out. She waited. And I'm in a position now where... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Where I could use some support. Marian let out a slow breath. Support, she repeated. The word echoed faintly in the space between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Marian stepped forward. Just one step. But it changed something. You want help, she said. Victor nodded once. Yes. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since he had stepped out of the car. The man in front of her was not the same one who had stood in the living room that morning. Not quite. There was something missing, or maybe something exposed. I spent 40 years helping you, Marian said. Her voice didn't rise. No, it didn't need to. I kept your house. I supported your work. I built a life around yours so you could focus on everything you said mattered. Victor opened his mouth, but she didn't stop. And when you were done with that life, she continued, you walked away from it like it meant nothing. The words hung in the air, steady, undeniable. Victor's expression shifted, something uncomfortable passing through it. That's not fair, he said. Marian almost smiled. Fair? She repeated. The word felt strange now, distant. The court decided what was fair, she said. You got everything you wanted. Victor took a step closer. I didn't know this place had value, he insisted. You have to understand that. Marian shook her head slowly. No, she said. I don't. The silence stretched. Coda remained still, his presence a quiet line between them. Victor glanced around again, taking in the repaired boards, the reinforced structure, the signs of change. You've done a lot here, he said. Marian didn't respond. I'm just asking for a conversation, he added. An agreement, something reasonable. Marian looked at the shack, at the land, at the place she had rebuilt piece by piece, then back at him. No, she said. The word was quiet, but final. Victor blinked. What do you mean, no? I mean no, Marian repeated. There's nothing to discuss. His expression hardened slightly. You can't just shut this down, he said. There are legal The divorce is final, she interrupted. The words cut cleanly. You signed the papers, she continued. You made your choices. This, she gestured slightly to the land around them, is mine. Victor stared at her. For a moment, something like frustration flickered across his face. Then something else, something quieter. I made a mistake, he said. Marian didn't react. With you, he added, with everything. The words hung there, waiting, but Marian felt nothing shift inside her. No pull, no reopening of old wounds. Just distance. I'm sorry you feel that way, she said. Victor's shoulders dropped slightly. That's it? He asked. That's it. Another silence. Longer this time. Then Victor nodded once. A small, tight movement. All right, he said. He turned, walking back toward his car without another word. The engine started again, loud against the quiet. The car reversed slowly, then disappeared down the narrow path, is swallowed again by the trees. And just like that, he was gone. Marian stood there for a long moment. The air felt still again, uninterrupted. Coda moved slightly, brushing against her leg. She placed a hand on his head. He came back, she said softly. Coda didn't respond. He didn't need to. Marian looked out toward the trees, toward the path Victor had taken, then back at the land around her. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. She turned and walked back toward the shack. Her steps were steady, certain, because for the first time, there was nothing left behind her that could take anything from her again. The quiet that followed Victor's departure felt different. Not empty, settled. Marian stood at the edge of the clearing for a long moment, watching the narrow path where his car had disappeared. Well, the trees had already swallowed any sign of him. The forest had a way of doing that, absorbing what didn't belong. She let out a slow breath. Then she turned back toward the shack, toward her work. The next days passed with a steady rhythm, but something beneath it had shifted. The urgency that had driven her at first, the need to prove she could survive, was gone. In its place was something quieter, intentional. She moved through her tasks with more thought now, not just fixing what was broken, but deciding what mattered, what should stay, what should change. The shack slowly became more than a shelter. It became a structure she understood. The walls held. The roof leaked less. The door closed cleanly. Small changes, each one barely noticeable on its own. But together, they formed something solid, something real. Coda continued to move around the property, mapping it in his own way. He would lead her at times without seeming to, pausing at certain points, circling areas, drawing her attention to places she might have overlooked. The marked patch of ground became a starting point. Marian returned to it one morning with a shovel. She didn't rush. Each movement was deliberate, measured. The soil gave way more easily than she expected, still soft from the rain. A few inches down, the earth darkened further, damp but not saturated. She stopped, watched, then pressed her hand into the exposed ground. Cool. Alive. She didn't dig deeper. Not yet. Instead, she stood and looked around. The land stretched out in quiet layers. Trees, open space, the subtle rise and fall of ground that hid more than it revealed. It wasn't just property. Thus, it was a system, something interconnected. She understood that now. Later that afternoon, a truck arrived. Not unexpected. Word had spread. Two men stepped out, dressed in practical clothes, boots, jackets, the kind of people who worked land, not offices. We heard you might be open to talking, one of them said. Marian leaned against the porch post, her arms relaxed at her sides. About what? She asked. Development, the other replied. Water rights, land use. There's interest. Of course there was. Marian studied them for a moment. Who sent you? She asked. They exchanged a glance. Doesn't matter, one said. Point is, what you've got here, it's worth something. You could sell, walk away with more than enough. Marian looked past them, out toward the trees. She imagined it. The land cleared, structures built, on pipes, systems, people, noise, movement, profit. She felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear, not uncertainty, recognition. This place wasn't meant for that, she said. The men frowned slightly. It's land, one replied. Land gets used. Not always, Marian said. There was a pause. You're turning down an opportunity, the other added. Marian nodded once. I know. They lingered for a moment longer, then gave small, uncertain nods before returning to their truck. The engine started. The sound faded. Silence returned. Coda stepped up beside her, his body brushing lightly against her leg. Marian rested a hand on his head. They all want something from it, she said. Coda didn't move. She looked down at him. You didn't, she added. That mattered more than she had expected. That evening, she sat on the porch, the wood beneath her steady now, rebuilt, reinforced, holding her weight without complaint. The sky stretched above her in soft colors, fading from gold to blue. She held the journal in her hands, flipping through its pages again. The words felt different now, less like discovery, more like responsibility. Whoever had hidden this place had made a choice, not to take, not to expose, to protect. Marian closed the journal slowly. Her eyes moved across the land once more. She could sell. She could walk away. She could let someone else decide what this place became. But then, it wouldn't be hers anymore. Not really. The thought settled in her chest with quiet certainty. No, she said aloud. The word felt grounded. Final. Coda shifted beside her, settling down at her feet. But Marian leaned back slightly, her hands resting loosely in her lap. I'm not giving it away, she said. Not to Victor, not to strangers, not to anything that would turn it into something it was never meant to be. The decision didn't feel dramatic. It didn't feel like a turning point. It felt right. Like something that had been forming quietly, piece by piece, since the moment she stepped into the shack. She would stay. She would protect it. And she would build something here. On her terms. Not large, not loud, but real, sustainable, her own. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the scent of earth and pine. Marian closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, nothing had changed. The shack still stood. The land still stretched out before her. Coda still lay quietly at her side. But inside, something had settled. Not just survival, not just resistance. Clarity. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart, Marian Doyle knew exactly what she was choosing. And this time, no one else would decide it for her. Spring came quietly. It didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded, slowly, steadily, like the land itself was waking up after a long, patient wait. The trees softened first, their branches filling with new leaves. The ground shifted from cold and rigid to something alive again. The air carried warmth now, not enough to forget the cold months, but enough to move through the days without bracing against them. Marian noticed it in small ways. The way the light lingered longer in the evenings. The way the shack held warmth just a little better. But the way the land no longer felt like something she had to endure, but something she moved with. The porch beneath her feet no longer creaked uncertainly. The boards were firm now, set in place by her own hands. The windows held. The roof no longer leaked with every passing rain. The shack had changed. But more than that, she had. Marian sat on the porch in the early morning, a cup of coffee warming her hands. Coda stretched out beside her in the soft grass. The clearing looked different now, not because it had been transformed into something grand or finished, but because it had been understood. Paths had formed where she walked daily. The marked spot near the edge of the clearing had become familiar. No longer a mystery, but a quiet presence she acknowledged without needing to disturb. She had chosen not to dig deeper. Not yet. And some things didn't need to be forced open. Some things simply needed to be respected. Behind her, the shack stood solid. Not perfect, not new, but steady in a way it had never been before. Inside, it held what she needed. Nothing more. Nothing unnecessary. Marian took a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes moving across the land. There was no urgency anymore. No pressure. Only rhythm. Work, rest, repeat. Days that built on each other without needing to prove anything. Coda lifted his head slightly, watching something in the distance. A movement Marian couldn't see. His body remained relaxed, his presence constant, unchanged from the moment he had stepped into her life. "You were right," she said softly. Her voice didn't break the silence. It belonged to it. He had led her here, not just to the shack, not just to the hidden space beneath it, but to everything that followed. Marian leaned back slightly in her chair, letting the sunlight settle across her face. There was a time, not long ago, when she had believed everything important in her life had been taken from her. The house, the routine, the identity she had built around someone else. She had thought that losing those things meant losing herself. But sitting here now, she understood something she hadn't seen before. None of that had been taken. It had been left behind. And there was a difference. A quiet one. But important. Her gaze drifted toward the path leading out of the clearing. The same path Victor had taken when he left. She didn't wonder about him anymore. Didn't imagine what his life looked like now. Didn't measure herself against it. And that part of her life had closed. Not with anger, not with regret, but with distance. The kind that didn't need to be revisited. Marian set her cup down beside her. The wood of the porch was warm under her fingers. Solid, reliable, built. She had built this, not from nothing, but from something she had been told was nothing. Her eyes moved across the land again, slower this time, more aware. This place wasn't loud. It didn't demand attention. It didn't try to prove its worth. It simply existed. Steady, quiet, present. And in that stillness, she had found something she hadn't known she was missing. Not success, not victory, but herself. Marian stood, stepping down from the porch. The grass brushed softly against her boots as she walked toward the center of the clearing. Coda rose and followed without being called, his steps matching hers without effort. They stopped near the marked ground, the place where everything had changed. Marian looked down at it, then out across the land, then back toward the shack. Nothing about it felt accidental anymore. Not the discovery, not the struggle, not even the loss that had brought her here. She let out a slow breath. "Funny," she said quietly. Her voice carried just enough to fill the space around her. "What you thought would end me." She paused, not for effect, just to let the words settle. "Was the only thing that ever set me free." Coda stood beside her, still and steady. Marian reached down, resting her hand on his head. The gesture was simple, familiar, grounding. She didn't need anything else. Not approval, not validation, not permission. The life she had now wasn't built on what she had been given. It was built on what she had chosen. And that made all the difference. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the quiet sound of leaves shifting against one another. Marian turned back toward the house. Her house. Not because it had been handed to her, but because she had claimed it. Step by step, piece by piece. She walked up onto the porch, Coda following close behind. The door opened easily. No resistance. No hesitation.
Inside, the life being displayed in a way it hadn't before. Clean, warm, living. Marian stepped inside and bowed for just a moment, and hand resting lightly on the doorframe. She looked around once, then nodded to herself, not in approval, not in relief, but in recognition. This were her life now. Not what she had planned, not what she had expected, but something real, something earned, something entirely her own. And as it closed the door behind her, there was no scene of blast, no scene of something missing, only a quiet understanding that what had once felt like an ending has seemingly been the moment everything final began. Sometime, the life we talk a lot were never really ours to begin with. It would jerk the version we had our brow. Marian didn't find her train in the series beneath the shop, but in the quiet joy to finally stand on her own row. If you were in her place, would you have walk away, or say and repeal something from nothing? Let me know what you think, and if sorry like to speak to you, you are always welcome here.